The crystal on the table caught the candlelight in fragments, throwing pale fire across the linen. And Emmeline Lacey was watching her sister rise from her chair when she understood, with the quiet certainty of someone who has spent a lifetime reading the weather of a single face, that something irreversible was about to happen. Dorothea had that look, the one she wore before she took things. It had always been this way. The better ribbon. The seat nearest the fire. The last of the sugared almonds at Christmas, taken not with greed, but with a serene entitlement that made objection feel petty. Dorothea did not steal, she claimed, and she claimed with such conviction that the thing she took seemed, in retrospect, to have always been hers. Their mother, who had died when Emmeline was 9 and Dorothea 11, had called it confidence. Their father, who had spent the subsequent 14 years in a state of benign bewilderment regarding both his daughters, called it nothing at all because Sir Gerald Lacey was a man who noticed gun dogs and weather fronts and very little else. 30 guests filled the dining room at Chelford Park that evening. Lord and Lady Chelford had arranged the table with the particular geometry of hosts who understood that placement was policy, the Whitmores nearest the head, because Lord Chelford wanted Sir Harold's support on the enclosure question, the Fentons at the center, because Lady Chelford owed their eldest daughter a kindness, and the Lacey sisters divided, Dorothea near the candelabra where her complexion showed to advantage, and Emmeline 4 places from the Duke of Stannard. 4 places, close enough to see his profile when he turned to answer Sir Harold Fenton, far enough that their proximity suggested nothing. This was deliberate. They had been careful, she and Julian, in the way that people are careful when what exists between them is still new enough to be damaged by exposure. It had begun in March, at Lady Ashwick's musicale. Emmeline had been standing near the window, half listening to a soprano murder, Handel with the methodical dedication of someone dismantling a clock, when she became aware that someone beside her was suffering with equal precision. She glanced sideways. The Duke of Stannard, whom she knew by reputation as a man of few words and fewer social obligations, was watching the soprano with an expression of such courteous agony that Emmeline had to press her lips together to keep from laughing. He caught her doing it, and something shifted. "I believe," he said so quietly that only she could hear, "that Handel himself would have left by now." Handel was famously ill-tempered, Emmeline said. He would have left and taken the harpsichord with him. The Duke looked at her, not the glancing assessment she was accustomed to receiving from men of his station, the quick inventory of face and figure and dress that passed for interest, but a look of genuine surprise, as though a painting on the wall had suddenly offered an opinion worth considering. After that there were conversations, not the bright performative exchanges of the drawing room, but the quieter kind, by bookshelves in the pauses between dances, once in a garden where they had both, independently, gone to escape a particularly tedious lecture on crop rotation delivered by a baronet who believed himself an agricultural visionary. Julian asked her what she was reading. She told him, honestly, not the polite answer, but the real one. He listened the way very few people listened, which was to say, he listened as though her words were worth the silence he was giving up for them. She learned him in fragments, that he had inherited at 22 when his father died of a fever that had swept the estate like weather, that he had sat in the House of Lords for his first session 3 weeks after the funeral and spoken on a question of tenant rights with a composure that the older peers found either impressive or unsettling, depending on their politics, that he managed Stannard Park with a steward named Rowett, whom he trusted completely and contradicted rarely, and a housekeeper named Mrs. Jessup, whom he trusted completely and contradicted never. That he was, beneath the reserve and the careful architecture of his public manner, a man capable of extraordinary attention, the kind of attention that remembered which flowers she had admired at a garden party in April and which passage of Cowper she had quoted, inexactly, in a conversation about the English countryside. By mid-April, he was calling on the Lacey household. He addressed his conversation to Sir Gerald, as propriety required, but his questions, about the garden, about the library, about whether the household still kept bees, were questions whose answers only Emmeline would know. Sir Gerald, whose attention wandered past anything that did not involve his spaniels or the weather in the South Meadow, noticed nothing. He would sit in his chair by the fire, half attending, occasionally interjecting with observations about the setter's new litter that bore no relation to anything being discussed, and Julian would receive these interjections with the grave courtesy of a man who understood that Sir Gerald's dogs were the currency of his affection. Dorothea noticed everything. Emmeline had seen her sister watching from the doorway of the morning room, the careful cataloging glance she turned on Julian when he arrived, measuring his coat, his horse, the quality of his boots, the way servants deferred to him with the particular alertness that indicated a household run well. Dorothea did not want the Duke of Stannard. Emmeline understood this with the bone-deep knowledge of 23 years in her sister's orbit. What Dorothea wanted was the fact of him. The title, the 12,000 a year, the estate in Hertfordshire that everyone spoke of as one of the finest in the county. And she wanted the shape of the thing, not the thing itself, the way she had wanted the better ribbon, not because it was beautiful, but because it was the better one, and someone else had it. There had been a moment, 2 weeks before the Chelford dinner, that Emmeline thought about afterwards. She had come into the drawing room to find Dorothea sitting in the chair where Julian usually sat when he called, not reading, not sewing, just sitting, occupying the space. When Emmeline entered, Dorothea looked up with an expression of such transparent innocence that it confirmed everything it was intended to deny. "I was resting my eyes," Dorothea said. Emmeline said nothing, because there was nothing to say to a lie that small and that revealing. And now, Dorothea was standing in Lord Chelford's dining room, and the candlelight was catching the beading on her evening gown, and her hand was moving toward her collarbone in the gesture Emmeline had watched her practice in the mirror since they were girls, and the room was turning to look at her with the reflexive attention that society extends to anyone who rises with purpose at a dinner table. "I must beg everyone's patience," Dorothea said, and her voice carried the tremor she could produce at will. Not nervousness, but the performance of nervousness, calibrated to suggest overwhelming feeling barely contained. "I know it is not customary for the lady to speak, but I find I cannot keep silent any longer." She paused. The table waited. Sir Harold Fenton set down his fork. Lady Chelford's hand stilled on her wine-glass. Even Sir Gerald, who had been explaining the finer points of liver-colored spaniels to Mrs. Whitmore Page, fell quiet, more from the general hush than from any awareness that his daughter was about to detonate the evening. "His Grace, the Duke of Stannard, has done me the very great honor of asking for my hand in marriage." Dorothea pressed her fingers to her collarbone. Her eyes were bright, brilliantly, convincingly bright. "I have accepted." The silence lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then the room erupted into the particular chaos of delighted society. Chairs pushed back, glasses raised, Lady Chelford already calculating the precedence implications with the speed of a woman who had spent 30 years mastering the arithmetic of rank. Sir Harold Fenton was on his feet, clapping. Mrs. Whitmore Page seized Lady Chelford's arm and said something about summer weddings. The vicar's wife, seated near the foot of the table, began composing the parish announcement in her head. Emmeline did not move. She was watching Julian. He sat perfectly still, his wine-glass half raised, arrested mid-motion, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen before. Not shock, not anger, but a very precise, very controlled blankness that she recognized, with a lurch beneath her ribs, as a man deciding how to act in a situation where every possible action would have consequences. She could see the calculation behind his stillness, the weight of it, the room pressing in on him with its expectation, its champagne, its assumption that silence was confirmation. The room was turning to him now, 30 faces, bright with candlelight and congratulation, waiting for the modest dip of his head, the appropriate murmur, the clasping of hands that would make the thing real. The social machinery was already in motion. Lady Chelford was mentally rearranging her guest list for the remainder of the season. Sir Harold was composing a toast. The vicar's wife had moved on to flower arrangements. An announcement made before 30 witnesses at a dinner hosted by a baron. To deny it would be to call a gentlewoman a liar in her host's dining room, to humiliate Sir Gerald's daughter before his neighbors and his peers, to create, in a word, a scene. Dorothea had calculated all of this. Emmeline could see it in the way her sister stood, poised, certain, her chin lifted at precisely the angle that suggested joy rather than defiance. She had banked on Julian's restraint, on his breeding, on the impossibility for a man of his position and his temperament of public contradiction. She had, in short, wagered her future on the presumption that a duke would rather marry the wrong woman than correct her in front of 30 guests. Julian put down his glass. He did it slowly. The base met the tablecloth without a sound, and in that small, deliberate motion, The room seemed to understand that something was not proceeding as expected. The congratulations faltered. Lady Chelford's hand stilled on her napkin. Sir Harold's toast died somewhere between thought and speech. "No," Julian said. She didn't. 4 words, delivered without raising his voice, without standing, without so much as turning his head toward Dorothea. He said them to the table at large, as one might correct a minor error of fact. The date of a hunt meet, the name of a horse. His voice carried the same measured calm that he brought to the House of Lords, where he was known for speaking rarely and never without effect. The silence that followed was of an entirely different quality than the one that had preceded Dorothea's announcement. That silence had been anticipatory, leaning forward. This one was surgical. It laid the room open. Dorothea's hand was still at her collarbone. Her fingers twitched once, the only visible fracture in her composure. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice had thinned to something that was not quite the instrument it had been moments before. "I am sure you are merely the surprise of a public announcement. I understand your natural reserve. Miss Lacy." Julian's voice remained perfectly level, and Emmeline noticed that he used the formal address deliberately. Not Dorothea, not even Miss Dorothea, but Miss Lacy, as one would address a stranger. "There has been no proposal, no understanding, no conversation of any kind between us that could be mistaken for either." He picked up his glass again, considered it, set it down once more as though the wine had failed to meet some private standard. "I trust that clarifies the matter." Lord Chelford, who had been watching from the head of the table with the frozen alertness of a host, witnessing his dinner become an incident, cleared his throat. "Perhaps," he began, reaching for the diplomatic register that 30 years of hosting had taught him. "A moment of confusion." "There is no confusion," Julian said. He spoke to Lord Chelford directly now, and his tone carried a note that Emmeline had heard only once before, in the garden at Lady Pemberton's, when he had spoken about a tenant farmer whose landlord had attempted to cheat him of his lease. Quiet, certain, immovable as the limestone beneath his own estate. "Miss Dorothea Lacy has made a claim that has no basis in truth. I say so plainly, and I am content for every person at this table to hear it." The room had achieved the particular stillness of 30 people simultaneously deciding where to look. Most chose their plates. Mrs. Whitmore Page studied her asparagus with an intensity that suggested the vegetable contained the secrets of the universe. Sir Harold Fenton appeared to be counting the tines of his fork. The vicar's wife quietly abandoned her flower arrangements. Dorothea sat down. She did it quickly, as though her legs had simply decided the matter for her, and Emmeline watched her sister's face pass through several expressions: outrage, calculation, the brief flicker of something that might have been fear, before settling on injured dignity. It was, Emmeline thought, the wrong choice. Injured dignity required an audience willing to believe in the injury, and every person at this table had just watched Dorothea lie about a duke's proposal with the fluency of long practice and the poor judgment of someone who had never before been caught. Emmeline herself had not spoken, had not moved. She sat with her hands in her lap, her breathing steady, and felt the strange, vertiginous sensation of watching her own private life become public theater, without her consent or participation. Julian had not looked at her, not once since Dorothea stood. This, she understood, was deliberate. To look at her now would be to make her part of the scene, to turn the audience's attention toward the real attachment and expose it before either of them had chosen to make it known. He was shielding her from it with the same quiet precision he brought to everything, the same instinct that had made him remember the wisteria, the passage of Cowper, the fact that she took her tea without sugar. The meal continued. This was perhaps the most remarkable thing, that 30 people could witness a public fabrication collapse in real time and then return to their turbot and their burgundy as though the interval had been merely a draught from an open window. Conversation resumed in the careful, bright tones of people discussing anything other than what had just happened. Lord Chelford steered the talk toward a new bridge being built over the River Lea. Lady Chelford asked after someone's daughter who was taking the waters at Bath. The machinery of social England ground forward, processing the unprocessable through the simple expedient of pretending it had not occurred. But Emmeline noticed that Julian's seat was empty. He had excused himself between courses. She had not seen him go, only the absence of him, the chair pushed back at an angle that suggested departure rather than temporary retreat. She found him in the corridor outside the dining room. He was standing by the window, looking out at the darkened garden where the Chelfords' lime trees made black shapes against a sky not quite dark, the last traces of May light lingering at the horizon. When he heard her step, and he knew her step, she realized, he turned with an expression she could not immediately name. Relief, she thought, and something raw beneath it. "I must apologize," he said. "For what?" "For the spectacle. I could have handled it with more—" He stopped, reconsidered. "No? I could not have handled it differently, but I'm sorry you were made to witness it. You're sorry that I witnessed you telling the truth." He looked at her. In the candlelight from the wall sconce, his face was all plains and shadows, and she thought again what she had thought at Lady Ashwick's musicale, that this was a man who wore his reserve not as armor, but as architecture. It was the structure he had built to house himself, and she was one of very few people who had been invited inside. "I am sorry," he said, "that your sister placed you in a position where the truth required a public correction. And I'm sorry that the correction was necessary at all, because it means that something I wished to do quietly, and well, and entirely for you, has been forced into a shape that was not of our making." Emmeline considered this. "She has always taken what is not hers," she said quietly. "I have always let her. This is the first time it mattered enough to stop her." Something moved in his expression, the architecture shifting, a window opening in a wall she had thought was solid. Emmeline. It was the first time he had used her Christian name. She felt it land, not like a blow, but like a door opening, like a room she had been standing outside of, finally lit from within. "I had intended," he said, and she watched him choose his words with the care of a man handling something fragile, something whose value increased with every second it remained intact. "To speak to your father this week. I had a letter drafted. I had consulted Rowett about the south gardens at Stannard Park, because you once mentioned that you admired a south-facing walled garden, and I wanted to know if ours could be altered to suit. I had—" He paused, and the ghost of something that was almost amusement crossed his face. "I had a plan. It was, I believe, a good one. Your sister has rather demolished it." "I did not need the plan," Emmeline said. "I needed the question." The corridor was very quiet. From the dining room came the muffled sound of conversation and the clink of crystal, a world continuing without them. And in the space between those sounds, in the silence of a corridor lit by a single sconce, smelling faintly of beeswax and lime blossoms from the open window, Julian Carew, 6th Duke of Stannard, asked a woman to marry him. "I would like to marry you," he said. "I am asking you, not your father, not your sister, not the 30 people in that room. You." The word settled between them, simple and enormous. "Yes," Emmeline said. He exhaled. It was a small sound, barely audible, and it undid something in her chest that she had not known was held tight. This man who measured every word, who gave silence the weight other men gave speeches, had just made the most important question of his life sound like a conversation between equals. Because that is what it was. "Then I should like," he said, "to make one more correction this evening, if you will permit it." They returned to the dining room together, not arm in arm, that would have been theatrical, and Julian Carew was constitutionally incapable of theater. He held the door for her. She walked to her seat. He remained standing. The table fell silent again, but this silence was different, charged with the particular alertness of people who sensed that the evening's drama had not, in fact, concluded with the fish course. "Lord Chelford," Julian said, "I must beg your indulgence once more. I owe this table a correction, not to what was said, which was false, but to what ought to have been said, which is true." He turned, and for the first time that evening, he looked directly at Emmeline. "Miss Emmeline Lacy has done me the honor of accepting my hand. I make this known with her permission, and with the hope that this table will extend to her the warmth that her sister's falsehood briefly misdirected." The room, which had been holding its collective breath, released it in a sound that was part gasp, part laughter, and part the particular hum of society recalibrating itself in real time. Lady Chelford pressed both hands to her heart, and her expression, part delight, part the relief of a hostess who has seen her evening survive catastrophe, was perhaps the most genuine thing she had worn all season. Sir Harold Fenton said, "Well," in a tone that suggested this was the finest dinner he had attended in 40 years. Mrs. Whitmore Page turned to her neighbor and said something that included the words "knew it" and "the quiet one," and "always the quiet ones." Emmeline looked at her plate. The turbot had gone cold. She found that she did not mind. Dorothea left before the dessert course. She pleaded a headache, the only honest thing she had said all evening, and Lady Chelford's maid was dispatched to arrange a carriage. No one attempted to dissuade her. No one rose when she did. The social machinery that had, an hour ago, been poised to celebrate her triumph now processed her departure with the same efficient indifference with which it processed all failed gambits. She passed behind Emmeline's chair on her way out, and for a moment Emmeline felt her sister's hand brush the back of her seat, whether by accident or design, she could not tell, and found, with a clarity that surprised her, that it did not matter. Sir Gerald Lacy learned of his younger daughter's engagement and his elder daughter's disgrace in the same sentence, delivered by Lord Chelford in the library over brandy. He received the news with the bewildered equanimity of a man who had long since ceased to understand the interior lives of his children. "Stannard," he said, turning the name over as though it were a breed of dog he ought to recognize. "Good family, very good. Hertfordshire, is it not?" The wedding took place 6 weeks later in the small church at Stannard Village. Julian had offered London, St. George's, Hanover Square, the full spectacle that a duke's wedding was expected to provide, and Emmeline had said simply, "I should like it to be quiet." He had looked at her with the expression she was learning to read, the one that meant she had said exactly the right thing, the thing he had hoped she would say but had not presumed to suggest, and written to the vicar that afternoon. The morning was clear and warm. Emmeline wore white muslin with a spencer of pale blue, and carried no flowers because she had told Mrs. Jessup that she preferred the garden's flowers to remain in the garden, and Mrs. Jessup had received this preference as confirmation of everything she had already decided about the new Duchess. Mrs. Jessup stood at the door of the great house when the carriage brought them home from the church. She had prepared the south-facing rooms, not because she had been instructed to, but because Rowett, the steward, had mentioned in passing, with the carefully neutral tone of a man who knows the value of well-placed intelligence, that His Grace had asked 3 separate times about the quality of the light in the south wing, and Mrs. Jessup was not a woman who required things to be said twice, or even, in most cases, once. "The south rooms," Emmeline said when she saw them. The windows faced the walled garden Julian had mentioned in the corridor at Chelford Park. The light in the afternoon was extraordinary, amber and generous, filling the room like something poured from a height. "You remembered?" "I had Rowett consult the head gardener about the south-facing wall," Julian said. "He tells me it will support espalier pears, climbing roses, and I am told this is important, a quite remarkable wisteria. I confess I do not fully understand the distinction between remarkable and ordinary wisteria, but I trust his judgment in botanical matters as I trust yours in all others." She laughed. It was the first time she had laughed freely in his presence, not the careful, measured amusement of courtship, but the real thing, sudden and warm as the light in the room, and she watched something in his face open like a window thrown wide on a morning that had exceeded every expectation. The early months of the marriage had the quality of a language being learned, grammar first, then idiom, then the silences that carry more meaning than words. Julian was a man of deep reserves and deeper loyalties, and he gave both slowly, not from reluctance, but from the careful habit of a man who had been alone long enough to forget that solitude was a choice rather than a condition. He left books on her writing desk, volumes he thought she would enjoy, with passages marked by slips of paper on which he had written nothing, the blank paper itself a kind of conversation, an arrow pointing toward something he wanted to share but preferred she discover on her own. She left flowers on his, cut from the south garden, arranged without formality, because she had noticed that he looked at formal arrangements with the expression of a man confronted by something that was trying too hard. They learned each other's rhythms, that he was sharpest in the morning and most generous in the evening, that she required an hour alone after social engagements, that they both preferred the library to the drawing room, and the garden to the library, and each other's company to both. Emmeline wrote to her father every fortnight. She did not write to Dorothea. This was not punishment. She understood the difference, though she suspected Dorothea did not. It was simply that the bridge between them, which had never been strong, had been a construction of Emmeline's making all along, maintained through years of accommodation, of yielding, of choosing peace over truth, and she had set down the materials. Dorothea's season that year was not what she had hoped. The story of the Chelford dinner had moved through London's drawing rooms with the velocity that only the most exquisite humiliations achieve. No one refused to receive Dorothea. Society preferred its punishments to be ambient rather than explicit. But she found herself seated, at dinner after dinner, in the positions reserved for women whose credit was under quiet review, Mrs. Whitmore Page, who had been present at the original event, and who dined out on the story for the better part of 3 months, told anyone who would listen that she had known from the first course that something was amiss. "The way Miss Dorothea rose," she would say, touching her own collarbone in unconscious mimicry. "The chin gives everything away." Sir Gerald, prompted by a letter from Julian that was courteous in its language and precise in its implications, suggested to Dorothea that a period of reflection in the country might be beneficial. Dorothea went to an aunt in Shropshire, a practical woman named Mrs. Alderton, who had no patience for theater and less for self-pity, and who put Dorothea to work organizing the parish lending library with the brisk efficiency of someone prescribing exercise for a moral complaint. Whether through occupation or the slow work of time spent away from the mirrors in which she had always performed, something in Dorothea began, very gradually, to shift. At Stannard Park, the walled garden came into its own that first summer. The wisteria, which was, as the head gardener had promised, quite remarkable, covered the south wall in cascades of pale violet that moved in the lightest wind, and Emmeline took to reading there in the afternoons, in a chair that Julian had placed for her without being asked, positioned to catch the last of the light before it dropped behind the garden wall. It was there, in the garden, on an afternoon in late July, that she told him about the child. She said it plainly, as she said most things, and watched the information move through him. The stillness first. Then the slow, extraordinary transformation of his face. Joy, arriving not as an expression, but as a surrender, a setting down of something he had carried so long he had forgotten it had weight. "Are you well?" he asked. It was the first thing he said, and she loved him for it, for the fact that his first thought was not the heir, not the title, not the continuation of the Carew name that had held Stannard Park for 6 generations, but her. "Perfectly well," she said. "Mrs. Jessup has already begun airing the nursery. I believe she knew before I did." He sat down beside her in the garden. Somewhere beyond the wall, Rowett was directing the placement of a new planting bed, his voice carrying in fragments instructions about drainage, about the depth of the root ball, delivered with the methodical patience of a man who understood that gardens, like estates, were measured in decades rather than seasons. Julian took her hand, a gesture that still had, after months of marriage, the quality of something chosen rather than assumed, offered rather than taken, and held it. "I should like," he said, "to write to your father." "You have already written to my father." "Several times, in fact. He tells me your letters are the only ones he reads in their entirety, which I believe is his way of saying he approves of you more than he approves of his correspondence." "This one will be different." He looked at the wisteria, which was beginning to fade now, the violet deepening toward the colors of late summer. "I should like to thank him." "For what?" "For raising you to be exactly who you are, and for being sufficiently inattentive to his spaniel's training that you were forced to develop your own resources." She laughed again. It was becoming easier, this laughter, this openness, this life conducted without the constant calibration of living alongside someone who took things. She had not understood, until it was absent, how much of her energy had been spent on vigilance, how much of her intelligence had been directed not toward her own life, but toward the anticipation and management of her sister's appetites. That labor was finished now, and in its place was something she was only beginning to recognize, the vast, quiet luxury of attention turned inward, toward what she wanted rather than what she must protect. The son was born in February, when the garden was bare and the south-facing rooms were filled with thin winter light. They named him Edward, after Julian's father, and Mrs. Jessup wept. She denied it afterwards with considerable dignity. But Rowett had seen her emerging from the nursery with reddened eyes, and was not a man to let a fact go unrecorded. The christening was held in the village church, the same one where they had married, and Sir Gerald came up from Kent with a gift of 2 liver and white spaniels he had trained himself. Julian accepted them with the solemnity of a man receiving a diplomatic offering, and by the end of the week, both dogs had taken permanent residence on the library hearth. Dorothea wrote that spring. The letter was short, shorter than anything Emmeline had ever received from her sister, who had always written with the expansive confidence of someone certain that her thoughts merited extensive documentation. It said, "I am glad of your news. I hope you are well. I am learning to catalog books. I find I am not as good at it as you would be. The aunt says I file by instinct rather than system. She means it as a criticism." Emmeline read it twice. The handwriting was different, smaller, more contained, as though the hand that held the pen had learned to take up less space on the page. Then she sat at her writing desk in the south-facing room, with the wisteria beginning to bud beyond the glass, and wrote back. She did not write about the christening or the estate, or the gardens that visitors had begun asking to see, or the son who slept in a nursery that Mrs. Jessup kept at a temperature she considered medically precise. She wrote about the lending library. She asked what system Dorothea was using, and whether the aunt had considered separating volumes by subject rather than by author, and she recommended a method she had read about in a pamphlet on parish collections. It was not forgiveness. Emmeline did not think in those terms. Forgiveness implied a debt, and she had stopped keeping her sister's accounts. It was simply the first honest exchange they had ever had. Two women writing about something that belonged to neither of them. Julian found the letters on her desk that evening. He read neither. They were hers, and he had long since understood that the things on Emmeline's desk were arranged with an intentionality that made rearrangement a kind of trespass. But he saw Dorothea's handwriting on the envelope, and he looked at Emmeline, and she saw him decide, with the quiet discipline that governed every corner of his life, not to ask. "She is learning to catalog," Emmeline said. "Is she competent?" "She is Dorothea. She will be competent at whatever she decides to be competent at. That has never been the difficulty." He considered this. "And what is the difficulty?" Emmeline looked at the garden. The light was fading, turning the wisteria from violet to gray. And somewhere in the nursery, Edward was being settled by a nurse who sang slightly off-key, a sound that carried through the old house like something woven into its structure, becoming, with each passing evening, less a sound and more a fact of the place. "Whether she will ever want something that is actually hers," she said, "rather than something that is someone else's." Julian sat beside her. He did not answer, but then the question had not required one. Some things were said aloud only so that the person speaking them could hear their own understanding take shape, and he knew this about her. He had known it since the musical, since the corridor, since the morning she had walked into the south-facing rooms and said two words. You remembered. It told him everything he needed to know about the woman he had married and the life they were building in a house that was learning, room by room, to hold them both. Outside, the garden settled into evening. The wisteria held its color a moment longer than the sky, as though reluctant to let go of the day, and Mrs. Jessup lit the lamps in the hall with the practiced efficiency of a woman who believed that a well-lit house was a moral position. Rowett closed the garden gate, checked the latch twice, an old habit, born of a season when the deer had found the kitchen garden, and one he saw no reason to break simply because the fence had since been mended, and walked back toward the house. In the south-facing room, the Duke of Stannard sat beside his wife in a silence that was not empty but full of the garden and the child and the letter on the desk, and the evening settling over the house like something that had always been there, waiting only to be noticed by the right people, at the right time, in the right light. They arrive here, like a fabrication quietly replaced by truth, whenever they are ready.